Not long ago, torture was entertainment. The guillotine, horse quartering, pillory, the gallows. Methods we now see as medieval and archaic were once the public draw of hundreds and thousands in the center of town square. Today we tend to think we're elevated from that barbaric past, but don't mistake perceived civility for the end of power and punishment. It's only changed. Modern power doesn't need to scream, it just needs to shape. Today, we don't see punishment, we sanitize it. Penal violence is tucked out of sight behind concrete walls and turned into bureaucratic language. What used to be a public ritual of power has been transformed into paperwork, and our entertainment is no longer used to terrify us into submission, but pacify us into obedience. If you rewind just 250 years, you'll see how sudden and unsettling the shift really was. A revolution in how society punishes, controls, and reshapes its people. On March 2nd, 1757, Robert François Damiens was condemned to make amende honorable, a mode of punishment in France which required the offender to beg for forgiveness to God, his country, and his king, all on his knees, barefoot, and humiliated. Damiens had been arrested for an attempt on King Louis XV's life. He stabbed the king with a short penknife, but the king's clothes were too thick, and the blade only managed to pierce about 1 centimeter into the king's chest. After the stabbing, Damiens made no attempt to flee, and he was arrested on the spot. After being tortured and interrogated in an attempt to acquire information on his accomplices and organizers, to which Damiens gave no information, he was sentenced to execution by quartering. On March 28th, he was brought from his prison cell to La Place de Grève, where his legs were painfully placed into a pressure device known as a boot, and the boot gradually squeezed his feet until his bones were pulverized. Flesh from his breasts, his biceps, his thighs, the bottom of his calves were all torn from his body with red-hot pincers. His right hand, the same one which stabbed the king with his penknife, was melted away with sulfuric acid, and on the crevasses left on his body from his various violent wounds, the royal executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, who would later go on to execute Louis XVI himself, poured on top of the wounds molten lead, boiling oil, resin, wax, and sulfur, all mixed together. Sanson then harnessed Damiens' arms and legs to 4 separate horses to be drawn and quartered. But the horses proved themselves to be too weak and unaccustomed to the task. After roughly 20 minutes of tugging and pulling from the horses, Sanson was then ordered to cut off the tendons from Damiens' arms and thighs in an attempt to make them easier to pull off. One by one, the executioner made cuts to Damiens' limbs, and one by one, a horse was sent off, pulling away Damiens' body parts until he was reduced to nothing but a torso. At this point, the lords who organized the execution wished to speak to Damiens, but Sanson informed them that he was already dead. He had been for probably a while, but nevertheless, they insisted that the entire procedures be carried out in full. They attached Damiens' body to the stake in the center of the square and lit it on fire. Damiens' body was reduced to ash in 4 hours, but the last flame kept burning all the way until midnight. It's important to note that this violent act wasn't out of the ordinary. It was a deliberate performance of royal power. Torture and executions were spectacles of sovereignty, designed to dramatize the power of the king. If somebody broke the law, they weren't just violating a rule, they were insulting the king's very authority. So punishment had to be visible, and visibly violent. And in the case of Damiens, he made an attempt on the king's life. This time it was ultra-personal. Fast forward a short 80 years later, and we see a completely different methodology of punishment. If we look at the rules drawn up by Léon Fouché for the House of Young Prisoners in Paris, and compare it to the exorbitant display of violence towards Damiens, Fouché's rules seem like they're coming from a completely different world. They read with an air of civility. Prisoners are ordered into camps. Their lives are regimented with wake-up calls, work, meals interrupting work, schooling, whether it be math, art, arithmetic, more work followed by some socializing in the evening and then an early bedtime. The strict regimented lifestyle, The meals, the schooling, the labor. It doesn't even seem that awful when you compare it to somebody living in today's conditions. In fact, it might actually sound better to a lot of people. But that's exactly how they wanted the prisoners to feel. This new system didn't need fire or pincers. It doesn't control through pain, but through repetition. Compared to Damiens, these prisoners might seem free, but they're being molded, shaped, and trained by invisible forces. The power is quieter, but it hasn't gone away. Of course, it's a little unfair to compare this routine to Damiens' execution. They're punishing a totally different type of criminal and a totally different type of crime. But still, we have the difference between inhumane medieval torture and a timetable. And it's a little bit staggering that the gap between these two types of punishment is less than a century. So how did we get from molten lead to math lessons? And what kind of power prefers quiet obedience to violent spectacle? In French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault's book, Discipline and Punish, he traces the transformation of punishment from gruesome torture like Damiens to the clean, quiet discipline of modern prisons. Foucault isn't just interested in what changed, he's asking why. Why did power stop putting itself on display and start operating behind closed doors? Why did punishment go from this huge spectacle to something quiet, regulated, and boring? According to Foucault, it's not because we became more humane. It's because power became more efficient. In the Ancien Régime of France, before the French Revolution, the law didn't just prohibit, it avenged. When someone broke the law, they weren't just committing a crime against society or a rule book. They were committing a crime against the sovereign himself, against the king, against the body of the monarch. And that made crime not just a legal issue, but a political one, a direct threat to royal authority. While living under a monarchy, political threats are dealt with loud repression and excess displays of power in order to justify the existence of the monarch. And therefore, simple crimes against the monarchy need to display that same excess power. They had to show everyone what happened when you messed with the king. That's why all the craziest and iconographic images of torture devices come out of medieval times. They existed when torture was a useful form of entertainment and repression. They weren't just methods of extracting information the way that most people think about torture now. They were a performance, public reaffirmation of power. The goal wasn't just to kill the criminal, but it was to dramatize the might of the sovereign by destroying the criminal's body in the most spectacular way possible. In Discipline and Punish, Michel Foucault opens with the execution of Damiens for a reason. That grotesque, almost operatic display of pain isn't just a relic of a barbaric age. It's what Foucault likes to call the theatricality of punishment. The forces of power were able to take ownership of the offender's body through this puppeteering and mutilation. But that sense of sovereign ownership over the body wouldn't have been possible if all of these executions and displays of power had been done in sealed-off rooms. The people had to know that they existed. They had to buy into the ritual. The crowd had to be there. Their horror, awe, cheers were all part of the process that made power visible. Public executions were the king's way of showing off that he was still in charge, that any transgression against him would be repaid with tenfold force. As Foucault puts it, the body of the condemned is the place where the vengeance of the sovereign is applied, the anchoring point for a manifestation of power. Pain wasn't incidental, it was essential. The suffering was the point. A wounded body was the screen on which the state projected its dominance. This is why executions had to be messy, painful, and prolonged. A swift beheading didn't communicate the same message as hours of drawn-out agony, and it alienated much of the audience, ridding them of their built-up expectations of what a public execution should be like. During the first recorded incident of execution via guillotine in France, there were reports of general public dissatisfaction with the event. They all bemoaned the swiftness and the general lack of visibility. People wanted to see the execution with their own eyes. The more the body was broken, the better, and the stronger the king appeared. A simple death, a swift beheading, couldn't fully express the sovereign's wrath. That's why executioners didn't just kill. They dismembered, burned, disemboweled, flayed, and quartered. And most importantly, they did it all in public. But there was also a deeper logic at play. It wasn't just revenge, it was restoration. The criminal had disturbed the social order. The punishment was meant to restore by reenacting that very same crime, but this time onto the offender. The scaffold had become a stage, where the executioner was the actor of the king's will, and the audience was a participant in the reaffirmation of royal authority. But that's also where problems began. The crowd, in theory, was supposed to support the performance. They were expected to react with horror or gratitude, to side with the sovereign and despise the criminal. But they didn't always cooperate. Sometimes they booed the executioner. Sometimes they threw rocks. Sometimes they cheered for the condemned, especially if they felt that the punishment was a little bit too strong for the offense. Riots would break out, and the spectacle had gone out of control. The theater of power started to misfire. In other words, the king couldn't always control the narrative. And that's dangerous when your entire system relies on public perception. This, in part, is what led to the decline of public torture. But Foucault argues it wasn't about moral progress or growing humanitarianism. The shift wasn't driven by kindness, it was driven by efficiency. Torture was too unstable, too messy, too theatrical. And worst of all, it wasn't effective. If you want to maintain order, if you want to shape a populace, there are better tools at your disposal than horses and fire. So, over time, the target of punishment changed. In the old system, punishment focused on the body. It was direct, physical, brutal. The body was both the instrument and the message. But in the new system, the target shifted to the soul. The goal wasn't to destroy the offender. No. Now, it was to transform them, to reshape their behavior, to rehabilitate, or at least to normalize them. This is the major shift that Foucault is tracking. It's not that punishment disappeared, it just became internal, quieter, hidden. It was a matter of rules and procedures and regulations. No longer a ritual carried out in public, but a process managed by institutions. Punishment no longer needed to terrify the masses, it needed to organize them, structure them, make them useful. This shift also meant that power itself changed form. And yeah, my camera died, but I just fixed it now, okay? So now you're gonna get this view, okay? I'm sorry. Sovereign power, the kind embodied by the king, was about spectacle and destruction. But disciplinary power, the kind that was emerging in prisons, schools, and factories, was about observation, training, and correction. And it didn't need a stage. It needed a system. Foucault doesn't believe this new system is more humane. It's just more subtle. It's a different technology of power. One that doesn't need to burn bodies to function. One that works through routines, spaces, and surveillance. So if you're wondering why Damiens' execution feels so alien to us today, it's not because of the violence, it's because of the visibility. That level of state power is no longer shown in public, but that doesn't mean it's gone. It's just moved offstage, into institutions, into habits. Of course, horrific stately displays of power are still broadcasted publicly, but they're operating in completely different modes today, and we'll talk about that in our next section. If sovereign power worked like a hammer, striking visibly, dramatically, a single blow, then disciplinary power works like water. It doesn't break you all at once. It seeps in, surrounds you, and shapes you patiently. Just as rivers carve canyons and tides hollow out stone, our schools, workplaces, and prisons shape us day by day. The routines we follow, the bells that ring, the metrics that we chase, they guide our behavior, mold our desire, and tell us what's normal. And like water, their influence is easy to miss until you look back and realize that the ground beneath you has shifted. So punishment decentralized and embedded itself into every aspect of daily life. This is the heart of Foucault's next observation, that discipline became the new logic of power. Discipline isn't about avenging the crime committed on a king, it's about preventing the crime from ever happening in the first place. And the way to do that isn't by terrorizing people into obedience, it's by training them. Schools, hospitals, and military barracks all start to look eerily similar during this transition. And that's no coincidence. Let's go back to Faucher's prison. What seems like a tidy, orderly schedule is just another technique of control. Everything is accounted for. Time, space, movement. Wake up at 6, work until 9, 2 hours of school, eat, work, early bedtime. Lights out, do it again. It's not about punishment, it's about normalization. Discipline doesn't break the body, it organizes it, turning it into a productive machine. And this machine is expected to follow the rules not because it is scared of being punished, but because that's just what machines do. Foucault identifies several tools that discipline uses to achieve this transformation. The first is hierarchical observation. This is the power of surveillance, not just the ability to watch, but to watch systematically. In a school, a guard tower isn't needed if a teacher stands at the front, scanning the rows. In a hospital, the patient is monitored by nurses, who are then monitored by doctors, who are monitored by administrators. Everyone is visible, and everyone knows they are visible. Then there's normalizing judgment. This is the power to define what's normal and what isn't. It works in a binary mode, good, evil, and they reward and punish accordingly. In a disciplinary society, it isn't enough to behave legally. You're expected to behave correctly. You're graded, scored, compared. You're too slow, too loud, not neat enough. Every institution has its own set of standards. And falling short of those standards, even if you haven't broken any laws, marks you as deviant. The idea of correctness gets internalized. You start policing yourself. You sit up straighter in class. You shave yourself before the interview like I did before this video. And you only speak when you're spoken to. Finally, there's examination, the perfect fusion of the other two. The exam watches you and judges you. It records your name, your performance, your score. It produces knowledge about you, and therefore produces who you are. Student, delinquent. Gifted, troubled. The exam isn't just a test, it's a labeling machine. And once you've been labeled, that's it. The system knows what it's going to do with you. So where does this leave us? To a vision of society where power doesn't need to raise its voice. It doesn't need the guillotine. Instead, it speaks through report cards, timetables, medical charts, progress reviews. The new ideal isn't the cowering subject before the king, it's the docile body. A body that is trained, optimized, and made useful. A body that internalizes the rules and follows them without needing to be told. Or, in other words, a body which has lost control over its soul. And this isn't limited to prisons. Like I mentioned, it becomes the logic of schools, factories, hospitals, the workplace, and now the internet. Think about how job interviews evaluate you for your cultural fit. Think about how student report cards reduce a life to grades and comments. Think about Fitbits and smartwatches and different productivity trackers, tools that allow you to monitor yourself, to discipline your body when nobody is watching. But here's the unsettling part. There's no single villain behind this. Disciplinary power doesn't need a king on a throne or a warden with a whip. It operates through systems, incentives, and habits that no one person created, but many people benefit from. Governments, corporations, and institutions don't conspire together in order to discipline the populace. They just need to align themselves on a few shared goals: productivity, predictability, and profit. The Fitbit might help you stay healthy, but it also trains you to value optimization. It teaches your body to perform like a machine. It helps you, but it also helps your employer, your insurance provider, your government. You become more efficient, more self-regulating, and more normal. The brilliance of disciplinary power is that it doesn't feel like control. It feels like self-improvement, because you're learning to succeed within the very system that shaped you to want to succeed that way. You chase productivity not because it's useful to you, but because you've been trained to see value in it. And it works because it's invisible. It doesn't shout at you. It whispers, be good, be normal. It makes the individual both the target of control and the instrument of it. You don't need a prison warden when you've already become your own. In the late 18th century, British philosopher Jeremy Bentham came up with, I don't know why, I said that like he's French, he's British, came up with what he believed was the ultimate prison, the Panopticon. Imagine a circular building with a watchtower in its center. The cells line the outer ring, each one backlit, so the prisoner is always visible, while the watchtower sits in the middle and sits in shadow. The prisoners can't see inside it. They never know if someone's watching, but they have to assume that somebody always is. That assumption alone does the disciplinary work. Whether or not someone's actually in the watchtower is irrelevant. The possibility alone is enough to keep everybody in check. But to Foucault, this wasn't just a prison design. This was a beautiful metaphor for how power operates in our modern society. He calls it panopticism, a system in which people are constantly visible, constantly monitored, and, most importantly, begin to monitor themselves. Let's pause here and think about how this is so different from the torture that we saw earlier. Sovereign power is about spectacle. Everyone sees the condemned, and the king's wrath is put on display. But in panopticism, it's the individual who's always visible. There's no crowd, no stage, just you, and the possibility that somebody's always watching. Panopticism shapes the soul and trains you to conform not out of fear of violence, but out of fear of being seen. Panopticism spread and has become the model for all institutions of power. And while Bentham's prison may have never been built exactly the way that he envisioned it, Foucault says that it didn't need to be, because the idea of the Panopticon has already been realized. Not in one prison with one giant tower, but in many subtle ways. I mean, I'm sure many of you have already thought of good examples of panopticism in our current day. We carry a surveillance machine on us at all times. I'm recording with one right now. We broadcast our lives on social media. We track our productivity, count our steps, monitor our habits, watch what we say because the mic might be on, someone might be recording, the camera might be rolling. Modern panopticism isn't something that's imposed on us. It's something we participate in. We become our own wardens. We self-police, present the most acceptable versions of ourselves. Not because someone tells us to, but because we've absorbed that role so deeply that we feel like it's our own natural instinct. The disturbing thing about Foucault's idea is that this panopticism works through unseen internalization. The ideal prisoner is one who guards himself. The ideal student is one who doesn't need to be told to study. The ideal worker grinds through burnout without complaining, because that's what you're supposed to do. Where disciplinary punishment shaped behavior through surveillance and normalization, panopticism operates through internalized knowledge that shapes us automatically, simply by existing within modern institutions. It shapes how we evaluate each other, how we perform for invisible audiences, and how we've come to accept that being watched is just a part of existing. With the rise of digital media, this surveillance has only deepened. The rules we've internalized in a disciplinary society have only been reinforced through algorithms, notifications, and curated feeds. And funnily enough, just like in the time of public executions, power once again expresses itself through entertainment. Entertainment that doesn't horrify, but pacifies. We scroll through inspiration porn on social media, where systemic inequality is reframed as personal motivation. Each of these forms of entertainment offers the comforting illusion of engagement, growth, even empathy, without ever threatening the structures that make them necessary. They don't ask you to resist, they ask you to sit still. The spectacle hasn't disappeared, it's just gone digital. Today's media doesn't only distract us, it trains us. It keeps us visible, motivated, and self-correcting. In the age of the internet, the Panopticon isn't a tower in a yard, but like the prisoner staring at the darkened tower, wondering if they're being watched. We stare into the glow of our phone screens, never looking away. So what do we do with this? Well, Foucault doesn't give us a straightforward answer. He doesn't tell us what's right or wrong or even what we should do. He's only showing us how these systems of power evolved, how they changed, how, while they might not always look like oppression, they still shape, control, and limit us all the same. Panopticism isn't a blueprint for tyranny that he laid out. It was simply a mirror for modern life. Damiens writhing in town square, torn limb from limb. This was power once. Violent, spectacular, personal. A king's wrath made from flesh. Then, a quiet shift. The prison timetable. No more screaming crowds, just silent rows of prisoners molded by routines and monitored by guards, teachers, doctors, or managers. The drama is gone, but the control remains the same. In fact, the control is even stronger now because it's constant. It doesn't end when the execution is over. It shapes lives hour by hour, thought by thought. And finally, the Panopticon. Power without the need for guards, for observers. Power that makes you monitor yourself. What Foucault shows us is that power doesn't disappear. It adapts, it evolves, it gets smarter. It moves from the sword to the schedule, from the noose to the camera, from the guillotine to the algorithm. Modern punishment isn't more humane because we've become more compassionate. It's more effective because it hides itself better. And that's the core of Foucault's warning. The more invisible power becomes, the harder it is to resist. Because who do you rebel against when there's no tyrant, no dictator, no executioner sitting in the square? Who do you rebel against when it's just you? Checking your own behavior, regulating your own thoughts, choosing to obey without even knowing why. In the old system, at least you knew who was hurting you. Now, punishment is built into the structure of life. You don't need to be beaten or burned to be disciplined. You just need to fall behind, miss a deadline, say the wrong thing, or get flagged by an algorithm that you can't even see. We've built a world where visibility is currency, where anonymity is suspect, where being watched is normal, and being unseen feels disappearing. We've accepted the logic of the Panopticon because it's embedded into how we live, how we work, and how we connect. And here's the thing, Foucault isn't telling us to tear it down. He isn't handing us a blueprint for a revolution. He's only saying, look closer, ask who benefits, ask who watches, ask why you feel compelled to behave, even when no one's telling you what to do. Because when power becomes invisible, the first step to resisting it is making it visible again. After all, we can't fight what we can't see, and we've become really good at hiding what power looks like. The scaffold has moved off the stage and into our homes. Torture has been redistributed across the globe, and though we no longer see the gruesome violence unfold before our eyes, our collective selves remain the bodies being punished. All right, that's a wrap on the Michel Foucault video. Thank you so much for watching and sticking out all the way to the very end. Next week, I got another movie video. I think I'm going to do it on... Damn, wait, I just realized I can't be concluding it this quickly. Let's think about those ideas. Let me know... Okay. That's a wrap on the Michel Foucault video. Discipline and punish. Please let me know down below in the comment section what you thought of this video. Okay. Let me know what you think about, the ideas, panopticism, all this stuff, whether you think it's hella dramatic or whether you think it doesn't matter, like, bro, what do you mean? Like, dude, it's good to work out. It's good I work out and track myself and stuff. Shut up. You're stupid. Let me know if that's how you feel. Next week, I got another movie video. Gonna be making a video about Kazuo Hara's movie. It's called, like, Private Eros Love something. I saw it last week. Actually, he was in Smele for a Q&A, and I got to say the movie. yeah, it was super fun. So expect that. It could change, but expect that next week. As always, everyone who is staying right now, who made it all the way to the very end, thank you so much. I love you. Subscribe! Subscribe!